do Prince George, yes, this little guy, his mom, the future Queen of England, these Australians, and this Indian woman have in common? And how did the destinies of these people collide in such a way that led to the death of Jacinta Saldanha? This is a fascinating case of conflicting narratives, blame games, and above all, employment law that traverses two Commonwealth countries. This case raises so many questions about consent, about decency, about privacy, and where the responsibility lies in a workplace. So let's get into it. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I am Dr. D. If you're new here, please don't forget to hit subscribe. And for all those of you who are come week after week and watch these videos, I would please urge you to watch my last video, which was about Johnny Somali and SD Khan. And unfortunately, YouTube sent me several emails saying that they are not going to promote that video because it does have a few choice words in it. By the way, I am not the one saying those bad words. Those men are, and I was just pointing out how the law needs to deal with those people. Nonetheless, as you know, algorithms are not very forgiving. So if you haven't already seen that video, I would urge you to please go and watch it. And for those of you who are listening to this on the podcast exclusively, I know that you've noticed that Didi is not around, and that's because we live into completely different time zones. So it's really hard to coordinate recordings in such a way where she and I can be at the same place, sort of at the same time. So please don't worry. We have recorded a few things which I just need to edit, and then I would be uploading those, which will be full of psych analysis. So until then, I'm so sorry, but you're stuck with my voice. So let's start with the early morning hours of December 4th of 2012. Nurse Jacintha Saldanha was working her regular night shift at the prestigious King Edward VII Hospital in London, and one of the patients in her care for the past few days was Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, who was pregnant at that time with King George, the first royal baby. She was admitted to the King Edward VII the hospital for severe morning sickness. The nurse, Jacintha Saldanha, who hails from a small town outside of Mangalore, India, was working at the King Edward's Hospital and had found this job after decades of working towards her passion for caring for the sick. Jacintha Saldanha was born in Mangalore, India in 1966, and after finishing her nursing degree in India, Jacintha moved to the Kingdom of Oman. Eventually, her husband Benedict Barbosa and Jacintha moved from Oman to the UK somewhere around the year 2002, and they set up home in Bristol. By the time it was the year 2012, Jacintha and Benedict had two children. The older of the two was son Junel Saldanha, and the younger a daughter Lisha Saldanha, and both of them in the year 2012 were teenagers. Because King Edward VII Hospital is 2 hours away from the family home in Bristol, and that by the way is 2 hours one way, and with two changes of the tube, Jacinta continued to live through the week at the nurses' quarters inside the King Edward's Hospital in London, while her teenage children, Lisha, Janelle, and her husband Benedict, continued to live in Bristol. Each day, Jacinta would keep in touch with her family and coordinate their lives over the phone. And as any diligent mother would, before she would start her night shift every single evening, she would individually call Lisha, call Janelle, and call Benedict before clocking in at work. Around the year 2012, in the December of 2012, the royal family had recently announced that the Princess of Wales, Kate Middleton, was expecting the first child of the royal family, and she was hospitalized in the King George's Hospital, where Jacinta Saldanha was not only working, but she was also living there. On the morning of December 4th of 2012, Jacinta was on duty when the hospital receives a phone call from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles. Jacinta spoke to them on the phone as they were inquiring about the health of the Princess of Wales. For more detailed information, Jacinta hands over the phone to another nurse who oversaw the health and well-being of the Duchess, and the name of the other nurse was Carmela. Imagine how nerve-wracking it must be for both Jacinta and Carmela to get this phone call. A few hours after the phone call, on December 5 of 2012, This call and all its intimate details were broadcasted on radio by an Australian radio station. Turns out the phone call was a coordinated stunt and a hoax orchestrated by two radio presenters, Mel Gregg, who at this point was already a radio jockey for about 12 years, Michael Christian, who was 2 days old at this job. They were employed by a radio network which is called Today FM. In less than 48 hours after this phone call was broadcasted, the Indian nurse, Jacintha Saldanha, was found hanging in her nurse's quarters at the King's Edward's Hospital in London, and she left three letters behind. One blaming the prank call for her death, another outlining her funeral wishes, and a third criticizing her employer for the way they handled this incident. Nurse Jacinda was so overwhelmed and so overwrought with guilt that she had somehow helped in divulging this information that she ended her life. A week after her death, her body was flown back to India where she was buried next to all her family members. As you can imagine, while this family was reeling under unimaginable grief brought on by the sudden death of Jacinda, a blame game had truly begun. The minute this happened, everyone scrambled to point fingers at each other. Mel and Christian, the two radio presenters, pointed fingers at their radio station and their legal team and the managers who had approved this prank audio to be broadcasted to the world. The radio station Today FN placed the blame not on themselves but on the King Edward's Hospital, saying that they had tried contacting the hospital several times, but the hospital never responded, and that's why they released the phone call anyway. So let's look at what was happening inside the hospital immediately after the phone call was received. The King Edward's Hospital, the chief executive is John Lofthouse, at least he was the chief executive back then. He wrote to the family saying that Jacinda was told several times by senior managers that no blame would be attached to her, that there was no disciplinary issue whatsoever, and they had assured her that they believed that she too was the victim of a cruel trick. The the hospital manager went on to say that Jacinda was offered three options. Number one, she was offered time off. Number two, she was offered counseling. Number three, she also had the option of going home. According to the hospital, Jacinda chose to keep working. When an inquest was held into this later on, the emails that Jacinda had written to her colleagues just before her death were released. And in one of those emails, where she was blaming herself, she writes, quote, "It's all my fault. I am feeling very bad," unquote. This email or any other email has not been disclosed in the inquest for the public, at least I couldn't find it. And we have to remember that she's not the one who actually disclosed any of the details. It was the fact that she had handed over the phone to Carmela, and then Carmela is the one who disclosed all the details. In one of the three handwritten notes that was found after her death, there is one which criticizes the hospital staff and the senior staff on how they handled things. And the contents, unfortunately, of any of those letters is not known to me. I researched it as much as possible. If you somehow have it and you can give me a link to it, that would be wonderful. Please do that in the comments below. So, the evidence that was heard in the inquest basically said that it indicated that the fact that after recording this phone call, the radio presenters and the legal team from the Australian hospital were placing so many calls that it put Jacinda, unfortunately, into even more stress, and that led to her death. No blame was placed on Jacinda or Carmela by Buckingham Palace. They indicated that the nurses were not the ones to be blamed. Prince William, in fact, wrote a letter to Jacinda's family expressing his shock and grief at the untimely demise of Jacinda. Now, let's look at what was happening in Australia after the death of Jacinda Saldanha. So, just to refresh your mind, Jacinda passed away on December 7th of 2012. On December 8th of 2012, the parent company that actually ran the radio station, it's actually a major company. They own several radio channels and television channels. It's called the Southern Cross Austereo. They pulled both the presenters Mel and Christian off the air until further notice. Then they were facing a lot of backlash from all the advertisers by the time it was December 9, and they call an emergency or crisis meeting in which they are told to fully cooperate with the investigation that's happening in the UK. On December 10, which is 3 days after Jacinda's death, the SCA imposed a company-wide ban on prank calls, and they took both the hosts off air. On December 11th, 4 days after Jacinda's death, the company announced that they're going to donate all ad revenues for the rest of the year of all of 2012 to Jacinda's family, which would be minimum of 500,000 Australian dollars. And separately, they also cancelled the office Christmas party as a show of respect towards Jacinda and her family. On December 13 of 2012, Australia's media regulator, it's called ACMA, opened an investigation against the parent company, which is called SCA, and they looked into what are the commercial radio codes, what were the laws, what was violated, and what was not. On the 27th of January, this is almost a month after Jacinda's death, 27th of January 2013, the SC officially cancelled one particular show of the radio channel, which is called Hot 30 Countdown. 2 years after Jacinda's death, almost 2 years after Jacinda's death, the investigation in Australia was done, and the ACMA came out with their final report, in which they found that there was breaches of privacy done by the radio network because they broadcasted this phone call, and they sanctioned the radio station on staff ethics and training. In 2015, after waging a long drawn court battle, the regulator's final report found that there were code violations, broadcasting of an identifiable person without their consent, and this was done in a highly demeaning and exploitative fashion. The ethics committee also sanctioned this radio station. They also said that the sanctions included staff ethics training, so now every employee had to have sensitivity training about this. And there was a 3-hour broadcast that the SCA had to do for their own employees, which would be about bullying and depression and anxiety. However, the license of this radio station was not revoked. After Jacinda's death, radio presenter Mel delivered a TED talk, which, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, you can take it with a pinch of salt, is an absolute wonder of irony. I'm going to link this TED talk in the description box below. She hardly speaks about the victim, Jacinda. According to me, she says that she has been victimized. By mean comments, she seems to be saying that she was the one who was bullied, and she was even told to take her own life, which is the irony of all ironies. Now it's time to look into the role of the employers in both the places. Now that you know this whole story, and you know the steps that were taken in the UK and in Australia in the aftermath of this tragedy, let's try to figure out a few things together. Number one, how can an employee do something without the consent of their employer? That's the first logical question that popped into my head. Second one, did Today FM throw Mel and Kristen under the bus as scapegoats? So, this would not be anything that's going to surprise you. Of course, both of these employees took their parent company to the court. So, Mel Gregg actually filed a case in 2013, a few months after Jacinda's death. So, after the prank call tragedy, which was in December of 2012, you remember, was taken off the air, you remember that as well. She claimed that she had raised concerns about this particular segment, and she had even suggested edits before it was broadcasted. But the decision to air rested completely with the management and the lawyers, not with her. And in the legal action, in December of 2013, 1 year after the death of Jacintha Saldanha, Mel Gregg had filed a workplace safety complaint with Fair Works Australia, which is the organization which deals with employers' rights and employees' rights. So she argued that the SCA, her parent company of the radio station, had failed in its duty to care, and because of which she was the one who had to face a global backlash, and they left her without any support or protection. The outcome of this court case was that the dispute was amicably resolved and Greg resigned from SCA. She got some sort of a settlement. I'm not sure how much that settlement was, it's not been disclosed. However, SCA did publish a statement after this court case in which they did acknowledge that Mel Gregg had, in fact, pointed out to people in her department that this phone call should not be broadcasted. She was suggesting many changes to the phone call. So, the SCA did give a substantial sum of money to Jacinda's family, and they also had to give some money, which I'm not sure how much that is. They did give that to Mel Gregg as well. And her case, by the way, was in 2013, which was just a few months after Jacinda's death. Michael, on the other hand, actually filed a case in the year 2025. At least the judgment came out quite recently. So, he continued to work actually with this radio network, which really surprised me. And the context of the complaint that he has filed is quite different. He says that unlike Mel Gregg, he continued to work for the same broadcasting company, which is called SCA Broadcasting Corporation. He returned to the radio station within months of this scandal. He continued hosting shows on Fox FM and Today FM, and he stayed with the network until February of 2025, which was for 20 years with the same company. And in his court case, he does say that he was pressured into making that prank call. He never wanted to do it. And let me remind you that he was only 3 days old within that show. He was just absolutely brand new. And he does say in his legal filing that the company failed to provide him support in a way through him and Mel at the Wolves, and people were blaming them for what they had done. He was scapegoated and he was left to face the wrath of an international crowd on the internet. And because he was recently let go from this parent company in the year 2024, he does say that he was made redundant, and that was not genuine because he continued to be a model employee and he should not have been fired. The legal grounds under which he took his company to the court was under Fair Works Act, which is a workplace protection act in Australia. The second one was the Corporations Act, which is about a whistleblower's protection. The third was under the common law. It was simply a breach of contract with Christian. And then the company failed in its duty of care. The status of the case as of now, what I know is Kristen is seeking compensation for damages and penalties for psychological injury and for reputational harm. And he says that in the long run, it hurt his career opportunities. And in that sense, he was sort of stuck with the parent company. He couldn't go anywhere. Now, you must be wondering what's happening with the hospital. How did they compensate Jacinda and her family in the aftermath of her death? So, according to what I know, it says that after Jacinda's death, the hospital did establish something which is called the Jacintha Saldanha Memorial Fund, which is intended to benefit her husband and her two children. However, I couldn't find how much money has been put into that and if the family actually got any money. At the time, the hospital leadership welcomed contributions from around the world, but I'm not sure if the hospital itself put in any money. If you know that, please let me know. And I was also curious how much the hospital would have paid Jacinda's family for her untimely death. After all, she did sort of take her own life within the hospital quarters. So I was very curious about that as well. But it doesn't seem like they have compensated the family. Again, if I'm wrong, please let me know. Put a comment in there and I will correct it in the description box. But as of now, it does seem like the only money they ever got was out of the Australian network, and not from the hospital itself. So, the family, of course, has also taken part in an inquest, and her family's lawyers actually want to know that they were not really too much concerned about getting compensation. They just want to know why is it that Jacinda, who was a nurse, was attending phone calls. So in March of 2013, Jacinda's family lawyers questioned why Jacinda was the one answering the hospital's main line, and she was effectively doubling not only as a nurse but also as a receptionist. They raised concerns about whether her role required her to handle external calls, which is not even in a nurse's job description. This was part of the inquest, which related to inquiry into working conditions and a compensation claim against the hospital. I couldn't find any records of a formal settlement or a payout. Again, as I said earlier, if you know about that, let me know. Hospital leaders expressed condolences and reassured the family following the tragedy, but it doesn't seem like any financial compensation has been reached. Some reports released by vested interests. I'm not sure who's releasing these reports. Was it the hospital? Was it the Australian Broadcasting Network that was doing that? The SCA? I'm not sure who did it, but there are actually reports out there in newspapers that did point out that Jacinda had had a history of depression. But as you can tell, that these are strategically placed sort of newspaper articles, and they're basically there to blame the victim for the crime, and which I think is the most cruel thing of all. Anyway, so you and I are, of course, workers of some organization somewhere in the world, and we should all be very aware of our rights and our responsibilities and what's the chain of command in our institutions. So let me know about what are your thoughts about all the people involved in this particular case. It is quite murky, and I look forward to your comments. Until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.